You're listening to The Dead Prussian, a podcast about war and warfare.
Now, imperial expansion is a topic that is often studied in history classes. I know that in this side of the world, that's the side wedged between the Indian and the Pacific, generally we study British imperial expansion, or for those people like myself, we love to study Roman imperial expansion. But one area that is not often covered for a fair few of my listeners, and the demographic would probably be about 40 to 45% of my listeners, don't live in the world near the Americas. And one thing has got me thinking about how imperial expansion occurred in the Americas, because it's very, very different from how it occurred in other parts of the world, particularly when you look at some of the stories of people like the conquistadors and how they managed to achieve domination over numerically superior foes. G'day, listeners, and welcome to the Dead Prussian podcast. I'm your host, the humblest host I know, with a podcast named after a 19th century Prussian military theorist. But, you know, there is time. There could be someone coming along to knock me off the perch. They probably won't know because I'll hack their system and stop them. I can't actually do that. So anyone from the NSA who's listening to this, I don't know how to hack. Ladies and gents, thank you for your support on iTunes, Patreon, and those people joining the TDP community. It is great to have a new group of people engaging with material in our own bespoke social network. Now, the importance about the TDP community is that it's a closed network, ladies and gents. So if you are tired of Twitter and all the arguments that occur on Twitter and all the glum news, or I think my American friends call it a trash fire. I think that's the right term. Then jump on over to the TDP community, where we have civil conversations, we have groups, we have events, we do writing workshops, we do book clubs. Come and join us. Just go to www.thedeadprussian.com and click on the Community Hub button. Now, I mentioned some of the expansion of imperial powers in Latin America. Now, those people who know me or have heard me talk before or read some stuff I've written, I'm a big fan of Simon Bolivar because of his achievements in Latin America, but that's probably the extent of my knowledge. And to be honest, it's been a couple of years since I've read anything on Bolivar, so I probably wouldn't be able to tell you too much apart from the fact that he was a wicked horseman. So I needed to speak to someone who knows a little bit more about imperial expansion. And to be honest, Simon Bolivar came a long time after what we're talking about now. We're talking about the beginning of the European world's encroachment upon the Americas. The guest I have today is Associate Professor David Carballo. He's an Associate Professor of Archaeology, Anthropology, and Latin American Studies at Boston University. His previous books include Urbanization and Religion in Central America, and he's recently released a book on The Collision of Worlds, a deep history of the fall of Aztec Mexico and the forging of New Spain. David, thanks for coming on the show.
Hi, Mick. It's great to be here, and hi to everyone out there listening.
Now, David, before we start discussing the fall of Aztec Mexico, which is what I'm most interested in, but I've got to go through the motions and pretend I'm also interested in you. So I guess I'm interested in understanding what motivated you to enter the fields of archaeology and anthropology, and particularly studying Latin America.
Yeah, so I suppose back, even being a kid, I was interested in history. I could never really articulate wanting to be an archaeologist, although I was familiar with Indiana Jones movies and things like that. But in university, I studied political science, and what interested me most there was comparative organization, comparative societal organization. And so some of this book the new book is framed that way, of comparing developments in Meso-America and in the Iberian Peninsula over deep time. And the reason I think I'm interested in those two areas is a personal one, or a family history. So I have a transatlantic family. My paternal grandparents left Spain during the Spanish Civil War, so fleeing Franco and that army, and came to the Caribbean and settled in Cuba, got married there, but then soon migrated to New York. But some of their brothers and sisters also were refugees from that war. And settled in different parts of Latin America. So I have cousins aunts and uncles in Venezuela and Uruguay and Cuba and Florida, and mine just happened to come up to the northeastern U.S. And so I've always been interested in the connections across the Atlantic of those two worlds and the origins of Latin America.
Well, I won't ask you to answer this because you might get in trouble, but you mentioned Indiana Jones, and I recently understood that a revolver and a bullwhip are not key items of equipment that an archaeologist needs to take into the field. So I guess that was a myth busted for me recently. Now, your recent book, as you mentioned, is about the Spanish conquest of Aztec Mexico, and really, the title, "The Collision of Worlds." It's about this imperial superpower, I suppose, coming into contact with another regional superpower in its own right. Are you able to provide our listeners a little bit of an overview of your book?
Yeah, sure. So, I mean, what I'd say is distinctive about this take on these events, which have been recounted. I mean, Hernando Cortez, the conquistador, was writing letters back to the king, Charles I, Carlos I, who was Holy Roman Emperor, about this invasion of Mexico in real time. I mean, of course, it took months, if not years, for the letters to get over to an audience in the Atlantic. But so they were hot sellers of the time. Cortez's own letters, they gave Spaniards and other people in Europe the sense of seeing imperial expansion in real time, like they had read about for Roman expansion throughout Europe. And so they're very popular. And then in the 16th century, there are multiple accounts, including ones that are very Cortez-centric, like by his chronicler, who never actually went to Mexico, but Francisco Lope de Gomara was his chaplain and secretary, and wrote a very sort of great man narrative of Cortez based on Cortez's own letters and interviews with him and others. So that's one of the earlier European historical accounts. We also have indigenous accounts that are later, that tend to be the children of Aztec nobility, who are transmitting some of the oral histories of their families, their participation in these events. And then we have sort of what we'd think of as secondary later sources written by historians up to present. Most of them focus on the interval that would be called the Spanish Conquista of Mexico. We could also frame as the Spanish-Aztec War, which is really 1519 to 1521. So right now we're at the quincentennial, we're at the 500th anniversary of those events. And as we were coming up on that, it was becoming more and more in my consciousness and thinking of ways to commemorate this history in different ways. And for me, as an archaeologist, my training is really in thinking about comparative developments in deep time. So the context I've worked on in Mexico spans some 3,000 years, from the earliest agricultural villages up until the Aztec Empire and into the early colonial New Spain. So I've always been interested in being able to move temporally back and forth. And then here it was linking that sort of deep history perspective in Meso-America to one in Iberia to frame this pivotal encounter of 2 or 3 years in a much longer, broader perspective. So one that goes back to origins of agriculture in both areas, what's similar and different in terms of social organization, in terms of technology, including warfare. And when we think about warfare, it's part of it is the technology, but part of it is the ideology or the social framing for what is just to fight for, what are appropriate ways of treating dead bodies. Those are all parts of the similarities and differences we see between these two societies in this encounter. And then the last part of the subtitle, The Forging of New Spain, is of course what happens afterwards. What's the aftermath for about a century or so, through the 16th century, and continued wars of invasion. And something important there, and in the initial war, that it is sort of more recent historical awareness, is the active participation of native Mesoamericans in these wars, and the fact that things would have looked very, very different had the Spaniards not had thousands or tens of thousands of native Mexican allies fighting with them against the Aztec Empire. So those sort of strategic alliances, and it didn't end there, it continued. So people from central Mexico, especially the people from Tlaxcala, which is an area in Mexico that I've worked in, they continued to see themselves as conquistadors in their own right and start and begin forging a new social order that became colonial New Spain. And these included wars that went up into the U.S. Southwest, so like Santa Fe, New Mexico, that then crossed the Pacific as part of the colonizing of the Philippines. And so you see these Central Mexican footprints in material culture in places like Guam in the Pacific and in the U.S. Southwest and down into Central America. So that, so I'd say those are the two novel parts: is the deep history, the focus on material culture, which comes out of archaeology, and then being familiar with this particular culture area, and especially in Tlaxcala, and the contributions of native peoples to this unfolding of history.
It's I guess when your expertise is 3,000 years, I guess if you're covering about 500 years, it's probably a bit of a relief for a book. That you get away without having to include all the 2,500 years. Although you're probably going to have to draw on that to write the book. But I guess I'm going to jump to the bits of your book that I liked, and that's probably on the based on the bent of the show being focused on the warfare aspects. But I guess wars don't start spontaneously. Usually, there's motivations and political positioning, strategic interests, as you mentioned. So in the book, you discuss the Aztec Mexico Empire and the Spanish Empire on the eve of their encounter with each other, I suppose is a good term. It's probably a term I've stolen from the book. So how were the relative empires positioned prior to their clash?
So again, there are really interesting similarities, but very important differences. Probably more comparative histories have stressed the differences. So we can think of, books like Jared Diamond's Guns, Germs, and Steel, talking about a very technologically focused perspective on, what were the armaments in both societies. And those are important, and I trace them back in their own areas of Meso-America and Iberia. What's with the importance on metallurgy in the Iberian Peninsula, and what's the difference between societies that had cavalry and big fortifications, like Eurasian military powers, versus the sorts of warfare that developed in a context of mostly using stone tools, obsidian actually. So volcanic glass is the main fighting material for Aztec weaponry, not hugely fortified cities or not really substantial fortifications. A different technology of warfare that didn't include cavalry, that didn't include large naval engagements. Nevertheless, there's, I start chapter 4 with the expansion of Castile-Leon, the newly unified kingdoms of the so-called Catholic monarchs, Isabel and Ferdinand, and them pushing southward against Islamic polities, especially Granada, at this particular eve of the encounter in the late 15th century, versus the Aztec Triple Alliance, which is what what we call the Aztec Empire was formerly known as. It was an alliance of 3 city-states, with the dominant one being Tenochtitlan, which is now the heart of Mexico City. And they, at the same time, there was expansion southward into a region of Chiapas known as the Soconusco. It's right on the Guatemalan-Mexican border. And those distances, just in terms of land mass between the Aztec capital and Soconusco and central Spain, or the heart of Castile, and Granada, are almost identical. So in terms of like the territorial polity size at that time, they're really largely similar, but there's very different infrastructure, imperial infrastructure in both places, with much greater than capacity for invasion and conquest, especially maritime, that you see in the Iberian Peninsula, because of boat technologies, because of also different ways of thinking about what an empire is, or what relations of political hierarchy and subordinates are. And so we would frame, in terms of comparative history, the Aztec Empire as either an indirect control one or a hegemonic one, meaning one where relations were really predicated on just recognizing differences in authority and initiating tax relations between a conquered polity and the Triple Alliance, or in some cases, like strong arming city-states to be in the imperial fold and pay their tax and tribute, but then sort of being very hands-off, being very laissez-faire with the bureaucratic and administrative oversight of those territories. And so we can see that the Aztec political religious organization, we'd say, is very incorporative. It was out to just incorporate other polities, versus the Catholic monarchs with a very absolutist mindset in terms of religiously based conquest, and in this case, expelling the Moors and the Jews from the Iberian Peninsula. So, as a result, we have, like, as an example, in the Aztec system, it just seems like the pantheon of gods keep growing over time. From it, like where I work in Teotihuacan, which was the first megalopolis of ancient Meso-America, about 1,000 years before the Aztecs. We have X number of gods that we can identify in art and iconography. By the Aztec period, there are many, many more. Of course, we have much richer historical sources, so we can get nuance in like how different sacred entities were considered. But part of that also is that they would, conquer a new people and just incorporate their gods into the pantheon. It was just the more the merrier sort of approach. And they even had a temple in Tenochtitlan called the Coatteocalli, which is the place that would honor the gods of all sort of conquered peoples as well. And so it's a good illustration of that sort of incorporation of others, but then having ultimately a hands-off approach to administering them. Like, so there were very few fortresses in Aztec provinces. There were a couple, but they mostly left people to their own devices and then taxed the system. Whereas in the emerging Castilian Spanish system, it was much more direct territorial control. So that model is very different of how to administer vast territories. And after the period that, in later nation building for Spain is termed the Reconquista, but as those events were unfolding over 500 years, they were never thought of as a coherent war of conquest. Rather, they were just conflicts between northern Christian Spain and Islamic Al-Andalus that unfolded over centuries. But that sort of invading, conquering spirit that came out of that period then continued to push outward, and first colonizing places like the Canary Islands off of the coast of West Africa, and then eventually pushing into the Caribbean, and from one island to another in the Caribbean, and then eventually coming onto the Yucatan Peninsula and being on mainland America. And that really sets up these events of the invasion led by Cortez.
And it's interesting because I guess the similarities, as you said, is something that not covered, and certainly I know that I've actually never really thought about it. I guess I have read Guns, Germs, and Steel, where they focus on the technological aspects, but I guess quite often we look for the differences rather than the similarities. Hopefully most of my listeners are in the same boat, because that means they've learned something and they might tune into the next show as well. But our listeners definitely will understand that Mesoamerica was invaded by the Spanish, one, because we've both mentioned it so far, and two, Mexico exists, right? So people know that. But I guess what motivated Spain to invade Mesoamerica, and how did they carry out the invasion?
Yeah, Just starting a little back further again into the periods of Iberian history of the medieval period, we have society becoming increasingly militarized. I should say Christian Spain, the Spanish kingdoms of northern Spain. And an example of that is how the patron saint, Saint James or Santiago, is treated, where we actually see, looking at that material culture, like his depictions in sculpture on churches dedicated to him. This shift from him being, a wandering apostle, as he's known in biblical texts, who is depicted often with a staff that pilgrims still today who are doing the road of Santiago will have that staff with the scallop shell, as sort of a pilgrim and mimicking this apostle, to then Santiago Matamoros, the Moor slayer, the conquering horse riding conqueror model for Santiago that comes about in the medieval period, that change sometime, say, in the 13th, 14th century. And so that saint that we'd call him a conquering saint, a patron saint for Spain, becomes militarized. So we can actually pinpoint a place where there's an alignment of the religious underpinnings for the society and the military engagements of Al-Andalus, the Islamic Spain to the south. And likewise, we have the early history of the Aztecs being led by their patron deity, Huitzilopochtli, who is, for the Mexica Aztecs, the Mexica are the dominant Aztec group. Part of their migration narrative involves being led by Huitzilopochtli, certain combat that's like celestial mytho-history, and then him taking his spot as one of the two main deities on the Great Temple in Tenochtitlan, where he sort of again becomes militarized. He's the war god, also a sun-associated deity, and so the two of them have that religious conquering imperial framing with patron sacred entities in some way, and it's another fascinating comparison. But what's the difference then between the sort of warfare, the brand of warfare that the Spaniards brought, and imperial administration that they brought to places like the Caribbean, where they hopped from islands, Dominican Republic to Cuba and Jamaica, in wars of invasion? There they had seen smaller scale societies that were settled. They were agriculturalists, but they lived, in, say, hundreds or thousands, low thousands, in settlements populated sort of with those numbers in the Caribbean. And then there are excursions into mainland America. Even Columbus, in one of his journals, probably saw a group of Maya trading canoes, which were going between the Gulf of Mexico and the Caribbean around the Yucatan Peninsula, and remarks on how large they were and how many elaborate goods that they had on them. So there are hints that there are these larger scale societies in Mesoamerica than they had seen among the Taínos and other native peoples of the Caribbean. So there are a few expeditions sent by the governor of Cuba, Narvaez, who sends two expeditions before Cortez's with orders to only explore the Mesoamerican coast. And so there are Cordoba and Grijalva are two explorers that do this, and they first document large Maya cities along the Yucatan Peninsula. And when we look at the conquistador accounts of those early journeys, we see that they were taken by the urbanization, the high level of urbanism that Maya city-states had on the Yucatan Peninsula, and they give them names like the Great Cairo, and they were comparing them to the Greco-Roman Mediterranean or the Islamic North Africa, and in some ways saying, well, here are societies that are similar to our Mediterranean understanding of the world in terms of their urbanization. And Cortez then senses the opportunity offered to conquer. He's not authorized to actually do that, though Narvaez is. So Narvaez has the title that comes from the medieval Reconquista period of adelantado, the front man, the sort of the frontier or pioneer commander of a region, and that person is authorized for invasion, not just reconnaissance or exploration. So that's part of the reason that Cortez is then writing all these letters back to the king. He had circumvented the chain of command in his local area, and then to justify what he was doing with invading the Aztec Empire, he needs to write directly to the king and try to go over his provincial governor's head. That gets to some of the, I suppose, individual motivations, but then also just Spain being this, at that time, this territorially expansionistic imperial system that was, interested in resources, and it depends on, what period and what conquistadors or individuals you're talking about. Columbus had initially planned to enslave native peoples and brought some natives of the Caribbean back with him to Spain. He, found no market for them, and in fact there were laws against enslaving native peoples soon afterwards, at least as enslavement in a stricter sense. What there was allowance for was known as the encomienda, which is like a plantation type system of labor that wasn't in some effects like enslavement, but wasn't technically sort of in a legal sense that. And so there's the human resources. That a lot of the, of course, conquistadors are infamous for anything of sort of their bloodlust. I'm sorry, their bloodlust, but also their gold lust, that they were searching for mineral resources. And part of that, history goes back, and I take it back in the chapter in Iberia of sort of the waves of colonization of the Iberian Peninsula, and how Phoenicians and then Carthaginians and Romans had all been extracting mineral resources from these areas. And so that valorization of mineral resources that came out of that history then comes into the Americas. And then finally, with colonization, of course, there's the more sort of mundane agricultural economies that are transplanted from their Mediterranean setting, and many of the crops, in fact, were introduced by the Arabs and Berbers as part of the Islamic invasion. So what we think of as a lot of plantation crops in the Americas, including sugar, most importantly, but then things like, European cotton or Old World cotton, and bananas and plantation crops of those sorts. Tobacco, of course, was from the Americas originally, but those again become part of the base of the colonial economy.
It's good that you actually you said bloodlust as well, because it's quite famous, the bloodlust and the gold lust of the conquistadors. And even Disney's made a movie about the road to El Dorado and the desire for gold. But I think the conquistadors are the bad guys in that. I think they're probably the bad guys in most stories, though. Ladies and gentlemen, we had a correction sent to us afterwards by David, saying that he meant to mention Diego de Velázquez, who sent Pamphilo de Narvaez to turn back Cortez. Velázquez was the governor of Cuba at the time, and Cortez's superior in the Caribbean. So following their invasion, there was the Spanish Aztec War, or the Spanish Mexican War, and this is where the Spanish under Cortez conquered the Aztec Empire. But I guess you've kind of alluded to it when you talked about strategic alliances. This war wasn't fought in what many people would think of on how you conduct a conquest. So I guess, how was the war fought? And, was it a foregone conclusion that the Spanish would dominate it?
Yeah, that's a great question. Especially sort of what was the inevitability of this happening? How much of this particular invasion and war and the way that it unfolded could have been just replicated if Cortez had been turned back. If the next guy who came up, would have looked similar. And it's always hard to play those, what if questions. But there's no question that Native peoples were co-creative in this process. And the alliances made first with the Totonacs, which is a group in the Gulf of Mexico lowlands. Then, really importantly, the Tlaxcalans up in the highlands. The Tlaxcalans, in a sense, were Aztecs because they would say that their ancestors came from Aztlan, just like that's what the ethnonym comes from, the origins of that name. But they certainly saw themselves as different. So Mesoamericans viewed themselves really in terms of their ethnic city-states. And so they were quite different than the Mexica of Tenochtitlan, which is what we would think of as the dominant Aztec polity. And then later, the second largest city-state of the Triple Alliance, Texcoco, they splinter away and join Cortez. The fact that happened really was critical. I don't think that Cortez would have been turned back had he not had the alliance of the Tlaxcalteca. Now, would Narvaez have come later and done a similar mission? Yeah, that's very possible. It's hard to say what would have happened if Mesoamerican polities broke out of their more micro-patriotic mindset of alliance to a city-state and presented a more unified front of these foreigners versus us, but they just didn't see things that way. So it's hard to really speculate that there was no sort of unified Mesoamerican response. Every Maya and Aztec polity, and those cultural labels are problematic, but the city-states within those culture areas that we refer to by those terms, they really had their own motivations, as did just the individuals within them. So within a place like Tlaxcala, there's dissent against joining the Spaniards, and in fact, for some 20 days, they bitterly fought them. And it's great to read the colonial history because, of course, in the aftermath of colonial New Spain, the Tlaxcalteca, they had grounds for saying we should be autonomous, an Indian republic. We should rule ourselves because we assisted you in this war. And so then they want to downplay the fact that they initially had resisted the Spanish and fought for 20 days, led by a captain known as Xicontecat the Younger. And his father, Xicontecat the Elder, was one of the elder statesmen of this republic. And he helped to forge the alliance, but his son went against him and was eventually executed by Cortez. So the fact that you see within any political system that there was dissent about what to do in this event leads you to sort of understand that things could have gone very differently, especially at this pivotal point, which in Spanish accounts is known as the Noche Triste, the sad night. And it is when, after coming into Tenochtitlan, being greeted by Moctezuma, and sort of almost being treated with a lot of tensions latent in this 8-month stay within the city, but that they were treated as guests, the Spaniards and their native allies. Eventually, there's a Mexica resistance that pushes the Spaniards and the Tlaxcalteca and other native allies out of Tenochtitlan, and has them on the run as they return to Tlaxcala. And there's a big battle that's at Otumba, a city-state along the way. In those events, things could have really gone differently. That could have been a pinch point for the Cortez expedition, that if certain little things had gone differently, could have ended it. At that same time, disease is starting to spread onto the Mesoamerican mainland, and that sort of, in some sense, really makes it seem more inevitable when maybe half the population with this first bout of different diseases, smallpox and others that people who study paleopathology are still sorting out what exact suite of diseases spread through in this period in 1520. But that really undermined the Mexica Aztec resistance. In fact, it killed the successor to Moctezuma to the imperial throne. And so certainly that disease element, we can sort of understand in the middle of a pandemic how this could have had a major effect on tilting the tables in one way. But yeah, not sure if I've answered your question in terms of how was it actually waged, say strategically, or what did battles look like? And I'm not a military historian, I should say, so there are many really good colleagues who work on these. And Marco Cervera in Mexico is someone who's worked a lot on military history. There are books by Ross Hassig for an English audience. John Pohl is another one who's worked quite a bit on sort of the logistics of warfare, the weaponry. But some interesting points are that period of war for centuries against Muslims in southern Spain led to certain institutions, certain ways of thinking about warfare for Castilians that then were transplanted to the Americas. So I had mentioned that the title of Adelantado de la Frontera, the front man, that came out of this period in the Iberian Peninsula and then was transferred to the sea, to maritime conquests. Also, just this sort of roving cavalry, small-scale cavalry, and with some autonomy for the field generals of that time. So having a force like Cortez, like oftentimes people say, well, how could just say 500 Spaniards conquer this huge empire? I mean, those sort of roving bands making alliances was part of the model of the conquest of Islamic Spain, and so in fact, there were conquistadors who were so set on that model that Pedro de Alvarado, who's Cortez's sort of second in command and is one of the more bloodthirsty conquistadors, he conquered Guatemala, the Maya highland communities, Guatemala. He was pretty set on doing Peru, but Pizarro got to it before him. But then he had the idea that he could go conquer China the same way, that he could sail from Acapulco on the Pacific coast and with a small band, starting to find areas of political fissures within that imperial system he would conquer it. So that's just, I think, that's illustrative of the mindset that these conquistadors had. They weren't worried that a few hundred people making these alliances could lead these massive conquests. But so the way warfare evolved on both sides of the Atlantic was quite different. And everything from sort of the understanding of, well, what happens when you are conquered? What are the political and social relations between people? Where does killing happen on the field? So the Aztecs are often portrayed as bloodthirsty because of all the human sacrifice, but that was really an extension of warfare. And the Aztec system was one in which you didn't kill people on the battlefield; you maimed them. Usually with blows to the legs, and then captured them to then be sacrificed back at the temple. So a lot of those battlefield casualties then were just shifted to this religious context of debt payment to the gods within this other religious system. And the technologies, of course, were very different. Fighting with obsidian-tipped wooden weapons versus steel and arquebuses and falconets, which were the technologies of European powers at the time.
It's fascinating, the you've called it collision of worlds, and I guess when you think about the different styles of warfare, and even now, it's almost a special forces model of a handful of people going out and making local alliances to try and then invade. In fact, it's very similar to how the overthrow of the Taliban occurred in 2001, special forces. So I guess it's a model that is very different to how we see things, but also something that's not too dissimilar from some of the techniques being waged today. Now we generally know how this invasion affected the Aztecs, right? Like they lost, sovereignty. They were culturally, decimated. But I guess what did this achieve for Spain?
Spain, well, what gained, that you could tell in entitling this New Spain, the ambitions that existed for this area, this large landmass that again was populated at a much higher level, millions of people, relative to the Caribbean And so this was then seen as these kingdoms with and legends of golden kings and El Dorado and things like that. So they did know there was mineral wealth, and part of the early encounters, which included Moctezuma and other political leaders gifting to the Spaniards their valuables, which of course had a different system of valuation. And so the Spaniards would give headdresses made of beautiful quetzal feathers, a tropical lowland bird, or jade beads and statuettes and turquoise, which for them were really the height of luxury. They also had gold and they valued it, but they really didn't see it as different. I mean, we have some market registries like where you see jade essentially valued as much as gold. But that obviously was quite different for the Eurasian mindset that had valued mineral wealth for so long. I should say, metal wealth. And so that, of course, became a quest, is looking for gold sources. Mexico never had as many as then, later in parts of Colombia and Peru and other rich gold sources there. But they, of course, had a lot of silver, and so silver economies and silver mining became a huge activity. There was, I had mentioned these, plantation economies of New Spain. There were enslaved African peoples brought to Mesoamerica. It wasn't the degree to then in the Caribbean, somewhat because there already was a captive labor pool of Aztecs, Mayas, and other indigenous peoples of Mesoamericas who then were part of this plantation economy in the encomienda, and also worked in mines. It was, of course, a very exploitative imperial system. It did, in some cases, offer opportunities for their nobility, although it's interesting to see, in some cases, non-elites plugging into the market economy in certain ways. So just as a few examples there, I mean, so the former Aztec aristocracy, their children were educated in a European model and often married Spaniards. And so there was this new mestizo or mixed blood aristocratic Creole class created through that. There's some fascinating examples, like there's this one document from 16th century Tlaxcala, which I love because it sort of illustrates a new economic order. Cochineal is this insect that grows on like prickly pear cactuses, and when you grind up the bodies of them, you get this red dye. It's actually the dye that dyed the redcoats of the British military. So it's a color fast dye, and it had huge currency as part of the early global economy after this period. And there's a document from 16th century Tlaxcala where the landowners, the former indigenous aristocracy, are complaining that the commoners or the farmers are abandoning their fields, which of course were feeding them the elite tribute, and cultivating too much of this cochineal. So basically, the people had found this economic niche, a market niche that went around the former hierarchical economic relations to a feudal lord or a noble. And that was causing stress within this Indian Republic of the time. So certainly there was exploitation and power hierarchical relations, but there was room for negotiation and accommodation. And through that process, indigenous peoples and then mixed ancestry, mestizos, had their own opportunities for exerting agency and creating this new order that we know as New Spain and really the roots of Mexico.
It's just I guess I'm finding it so fascinating because I haven't studied too much of it. I've been to other parts of Latin America, and as I said, the independence movement period in Latin America I find quite fascinating. And now I'm starting to make some connections, which is something my lecturers said that I took a long time to do. So there you go. Right now, we'll probably take a quick pause so we can go to the bonus question for those members of the TDP community. And for those people who aren't members of the TDP community, we'll join the community and you can get the bonus question for each of the episodes. So we'll have a quick pause. And Now we're back, and that was a fascinating answer to what I might say is a quite insightful question, listeners. But David, I would love to sit here all night, actually, and it's all morning for you, and talk about this because talking about the parallels. You've talked about pandemics. You've talked about how we look at history. How we address the veneration of certain individuals and what they stood for, and the role that they played in the conquering of certain elements, and how that division still exists within societies. But we can't be here all night because my watch alarm will go off again, and we'll have annoying beeping on there for the listeners. I have a old digital Casio watch somewhere buried in the studio, and I can't find it, but it goes off every night for about 30 minutes. It's probably too much information for both yourself and the listeners, but I just need to share that with someone. So now, David, we'll go to the final question. And this is one I ask of all my guests, and it kind of relates to our mission on this show, which is to define war in as many ways as possible, just like Big Carl, the dead Prussian himself. So I ask each guest to finish the sentence war is. So now, David, I ask you to finish the sentence war is.
I'm going to put an Aztec lens on this answer and say that war is a flowery death. And what that gets at is this Aztec understanding of the flowery or beautiful afterlife, and for warriors who died in combat. And really interestingly, this gets to a lot of Aztec social organization, because women who died in childbirth were also seen as having the same flowery death, and the death included an afterlife and sort of reincarnation, spiritual reincarnation, as a butterfly or as a hummingbird, sipping nectar from flowers for the rest of time. And so in some ways, it's like the Aztec projection of a Valhalla or a glorious warrior afterlife, and then finds this gendered parallel in death and labor for women.
It's a fascinating answer, and I can honestly say, after 95 episodes, we have never had that answer before. So that's brilliant. I love it when we get a unique answer to that question, particularly because our first few answers, and hopefully they're not listening now, for our first few guests, were all very similar and boring and very international relations focused. So that's fascinating. War is a flowery death. David, it has been a fascinating exploration of the Spanish-Aztec war, the collision of worlds, as you've put it. I know I have certainly learned a lot, and I don't really care if my listeners have. No, I do. Honestly, listeners, I do care about you. Keep listening to the show, and I hope that you go out there and find David's book, which there'll be a link to David's book in the show notes, so you can grab that. So, David, thank you very much for coming on the show.
Thanks, Mick. It was a great pleasure, and thanks to everyone out there listening.
Now, ladies and gents, as I mentioned at the start of the show, we do have the TDP community. It's great to be chatting with people on there. At the moment, we've got a very interesting discussion on the warrior culture based on some of the articles on the Wavell Room website. So jump on there, have a chat, talk to us. And also we have some book club events coming up on the TDP community site. We'll be discussing H.R. McMaster's book, in fact, his book on dereliction of duty, not his most recent one. We'll probably wait a little bit. It's a bit raw at the moment. But, ladies and gents, you can find David's book in the show notes. It's called Collision of Worlds, A Deep History of the Fall of Aztec Mexico and the Forging of New Spain. You can also find David on Twitter, and that is at DM Carballo. And the Carballo in there is the Spanish way of pronouncing it, because I am bilingual. And that's double L for the Y sound. And also check out David's website if you want to learn more about what he does, and that is dcarballo.org. And you can find those links in the show notes as well, ladies and gentlemen, so you don't have to worry about my horrendous pronunciation of Spanish heritage names. All right, ladies and gentlemen, that's all I've got for tonight. So until next time, listeners, grab a book and crack on.
Join the conversation with us on Twitter at Dead Prussian Pod, on Facebook at The Dead Prussian page, or on our website www.thedeadprussian.com. All show notes for this episode, as well as copyright information, can be found on the website. The Dead Prussian podcast is written, produced and hosted by Mick Cook. It is co-produced by Amanda Levito. The music used throughout is Caught in the Beat by Broke for Free and is used under a Creative Commons Attribution license. All opinions expressed by individuals on the podcast are those of the individual and not necessarily representative of any other organisation.